1 hour ago, Paris, Jackson breaks. Silence. Her father warned her about Diddy. This is not just a courtroom story. It's not just another headline or social media frenzy. What happened inside that courtroom on day 17 of the trial will echo far beyond legal procedure. It was a moment when legacy stood against reputation, when a daughter brought forth the voice of a father long gone, and when a single piece of paper shifted the course of public judgment. From the outside, day 17 began like the 16. Before it, tight security, no cameras, a gallery packed with reporters, their pens poised, their silence sharpened. But at precisely 9:07 a.m., that silence broke not with sound, but with the quiet entrance of Paris Jackson. She wasn't scheduled to speak. Her name wasn't on the witness list. Yet in her hand, she carried something no one could have predicted, a sealed aged envelope with no markings, no fanfare. Just her name and a purpose. She approached the front row, whispered briefly to the court clerk. Moments later, the judge gave a nod. The room stilled. Paris took the stand. Her voice barely above a whisper carried across the room. "It's from my father," she said, "and it's about him." The silence deepened. Diddy sat just 10 feet away. He didn't flinch, but his attorneys did, leaning in, whispering urgently. The judge, normally composed, paused longer than expected before opening the envelope. Inside, a single handwritten letter, signed unmistakably Michael Jackson. The courtroom didn't just react, it froze. The letter began with a chilling line. "There are men in this business who smile in your face and steal your soul in silence." And then the name. "If my daughter ever crosses paths with Sean Combs, I pray she remembers this." It wasn't just a letter. It was a message written in a different time, meant for a future no one imagined would arrive in a courtroom. Paris didn't read the whole letter aloud. She didn't need to. The judge did. And as the words spilled into the courtroom, so too did something else: doubt, legacy, warning. But what was this letter? A heartfelt plea from a father, or a pivotal piece of evidence? The prosecution called it the blueprint. The defense called it hearsay. The judge allowed it. And in doing so, he shifted the foundation of this case. Because this wasn't just about charges anymore. It was about pattern, about power, about silence that stretched for years, and a voice that refused to stay buried. The courtroom no longer felt like a chamber of law. It felt like a theater of reckoning. And Paris, calm, steady, unshaken, was the messenger. But this wasn't where it began. Years earlier, long before she knew why the letter mattered, Paris found it in a fireproof box inside a safety deposit vault, a remnant from a father whose life was lived both under lights and in shadow. Back then, the words were vague. Names I didn't recognize, she would later say. Warnings that felt more like riddles. But now, in light of the trial, they made perfect sense. And that morning, without telling anyone, she boarded a flight, walked into the courthouse, and delivered not just a letter, but a moment. Because it wasn't just about Paris, it was about Zanaya too, a former associate whose testimony had painted a picture of manipulation and coercion. Paris, holding back emotion, said simply, "When I saw what he did to Zanaya, I couldn't stay silent. It wasn't rage, it wasn't drama, it was clarity, and it landed harder than anything before it." As she sat, the courtroom stayed still. Even Diddy's lawyers seemed unsure how to proceed. And in that stillness, something shifted. This was no longer a matter of testimony. It was history being written in real time. And it wasn't over yet. Because the letter was only the beginning. And what came next would shake the courtroom to its core. The courtroom hadn't moved, and yet it felt completely different. After Paris Jackson's statement, after the letter was read aloud, slowly, carefully, each word carrying the weight of time, there was a silence so profound it became part of the record. The judge cleared his throat. Reporters stopped typing. Even the gallery, so often restless, sat frozen. But what happened next wasn't from the letter. It was from the past, rediscovered, replayed, and legally cleared just in time. The prosecution stood asking to introduce a new piece of evidence, a voicemail. Not a statement, not a testimony, a voice. Michael Jackson's voice. The defense objected. The courtroom leaned in. The judge allowed it. The recording played. I'm being pushed into things I don't agree with. They say it's business, but it doesn't feel right. I don't want to be anywhere near Sean Combs. Keep Paris away from that world. Please. His voice wasn't rehearsed or theatrical. It was quiet, tired, real. And in that moment, the courtroom heard something that couldn't be unseen, undone, or ignored. The ghost everyone said was gone, had just spoken. No one, jurors, attorneys, even Diddy, could deny what had been heard. It wasn't an accusation. It was a plea. And somehow that made it more powerful. Paris didn't cry. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. The letter had raised questions. The voicemail answered them. But the defense wasn't finished. They moved swiftly, trying to regain control. The defense attorney approached the bench, requested the jury be instructed to treat the voicemail as personal opinion, not as direct evidence. But the judge didn't waver. This is the defendant being named, he said, and it's the father of a witness. We will not reduce a man's concern for his daughter to mere opinion. The courtroom shifted again. A second wave of understanding washed over everyone present. The prosecution didn't press the moment. They didn't need to. The jury had heard the voice, and the public had already started reacting. Outside headlines were being typed before court was even dismissed. Inside, the room felt like it was holding its breath. But then, for the first time since the trial began, the man at the center of it all, Sean Combs, spoke. He stood, addressed the court directly. This is a smear campaign, he said, his voice edged and sharp. Michael Jackson was paranoid. Everyone knew it. He warned people about everything. It wasn't what he said that rattled the room. It was how he said it. For weeks, Diddy had sat calm, composed, but now his voice cracked. His posture bristled. His words intended as defense landed as denial. The judge cut him off. Mr. Combs, you will speak only through counsel from this point forward. But the damage was already done. The prosecution seized the moment. Turning to the jury, they delivered the line that hung in the air long after it was said. He says it's paranoia. But how many times does a man have to be right before we stop calling it that no rebuttal came? No objection followed. Because for the first time, the courtroom wasn't deciding whether something happened. It was realizing it had been warned about all along. When court resumed the next morning, the walls hadn't changed, but the atmosphere had. The air felt heavier, the stakes more present. No new voices were scheduled, no cameras allowed. Yet everyone knew this was no longer just a trial. It was a reckoning. Reporters arrived early, crowding the benches. Outside supporters and skeptics alike filled the courthouse steps. But inside, all eyes remained fixed on one name, Paris Jackson. She wouldn't testify again. Her letter had already been entered. Her voice already heard. But she had become the axis around which everything now turned. The defense, scrambling to regain ground, attempted a shift in narrative. They approached with a new angle, not against the evidence, but against the messenger. Paris's credibility was now on trial. They began by questioning the letter's origin. Was it notarized, validated? Written with legal intent, Paris sat forward calm. It wasn't written for a courtroom, she said. It was written for me. And then without hesitation, not everything true needs to be notarized. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't falter. But her words carried weight. The defense pressed harder. They presented an old event photo, Paris and Diddy smiling side by side at an awards show. This doesn't look like fear, the attorney said, holding it high. Paris looked directly at the jury. In this industry, she said, you learn fast how to smile through anything. That photo doesn't show trust. It shows survival. There was no gasp, no outcry, just stillness. And that stillness said more than applause ever could. The defense attempted one final pivot. They insinuated the letter could have been altered. That grief and youth made her vulnerable to suggestion. That perhaps unknowingly, she had imposed meaning where there was none. Paris didn't respond immediately. Then she looked not at the attorney, but directly at the jurors. "I'm not here to guess," she said. "I remember how my father looked when that name came up. I remember how he lowered his voice. I remember what he didn't say, and how loud that silence became." She paused, then added, "He didn't shout to warn me. He whispered, and I listened." It wasn't just a defense of a document. It was a defense of memory. And in that moment, the jury seemed to lean closer. But what turned the tide for good was not a letter, a photo, or a cross-examination. It was a video. The prosecution introduced it without spectacle, grainy footage never aired, drawn from old archives. In it, Michael Jackson sat in an interview, guarded but present. "There are some in this business," he said, "who don't just chase success, they erase others to get it. I won't name them, but I've warned those close to me." The statement was broad, the tone quiet. But paired with the letter and the voicemail, it echoed like thunder. The courtroom didn't react with noise. It reacted with stillness, because it was no longer just Paris speaking. It was Michael through her, and through time. As the courtroom processed the letter, the voicemail, and the resurfaced interview, a narrative began to form, layered not through any single testimony, but through resonance. Across days of arguments and evidence, one question returned again and again. What if Michael Jackson wasn't paranoid? The defense attempted to reframe. They brought out more photos, public appearances, smiling moments, shared stages between Michael and Diddy. They argued proximity proved peace. That business was business. That legacy could be misleading. But the prosecution struck back with precision. Power doesn't just demand silence, they said. It rewards it. And for the first time, they invoked a second name, a name mentioned by Paris, a name the court had heard once before Zanaya. Her testimony, quietly delivered days earlier, had painted a story of manipulation, subtle control, emotional erosion. At the time, it had been powerful. Now it felt predictive. Because Michael's words in the letter about influence exploitation, masks of charm, had aligned perfectly with Zanaya's account. Different voices, same pattern. The prosecution framed it clearly. This is not about isolated claims. This is about a man who knew the game, saw its players, and wrote it down before any of us were ready to listen. The courtroom began to see it. Not as isolated moments, but as a design, a rhythm, praise, control, silence. And at the center, Paris. Her testimony, framed through personal memory, had now become a larger key. The prosecution concluded, it's not just that she told the truth, it's that the truth keeps finding her. That night, headlines exploded. The courtroom may have banned cameras, but the world was watching nonetheless. Social media lit up with fragments. He lifts people to clip their wings. If they try to erase your story, tell mine. The words weren't just quotes anymore. They were rallying cries, and Diddy. His posture changed. Each day he leaned further back, spoke less, avoided the jury's eyes. The man once described as unshakable now seemed unsure. Not yet defeated, but surrounded. Outside protests sparked. Signs were raised. We believe Paris. Legacy speaks louder. Truth doesn't expire. The defense tried to downplay the scale. They called it a media storm, a distraction. But they couldn't stop what had already begun, because it wasn't just about Diddy anymore. It was about the system that protected him, about how many warnings were ignored, about how much silence had been bought, bartered, or buried. The next morning, court adjourned early. No fanfare, No dramatic ruling, just a long weekend ahead and instructions for the jury to prepare for closing arguments. But the energy was different. The trial hadn't ended, but something else had. The illusion, and in its place, something stronger, memory testimony, and the voice of a father who had managed to protect his daughter long after he was gone. By the time Paris Jackson left the courtroom for the final time, she wasn't just seen as Michael Jackson's daughter. She was seen as the voice of his legacy. And more than that, its protector. She didn't give interviews, didn't smile for cameras. She simply stepped into the hallway, arms crossed, head low. And yet, the world outside felt louder than ever. Podcasts dissected every sentence. Hashtags surged. Commentators from all backgrounds weighed in. Not on the legal minutia, but on the meaning. On what it said about power protection and prophecy. And inside the courtroom, the echo of her father's voice refused to fade. The jury returned, instructed to listen closely to the closing arguments. But their faces already told the story. Something had shifted. You could see it in the way they looked at the defendant, in the way they watched Paris when old footage replayed. They were no longer just evaluating evidence. They were measuring character. The prosecution opened with resolve. You've heard from two people this week. Zanaya, who risked everything to speak, and Paris Jackson, who carried her father's voice into this room. They paused, then continued. Mr. Combs says, this is paranoia. But how many times must someone be right before we stop calling it that? They invoked not fear, but foresight. Not guilt, but gravity. They reminded the jury this wasn't just about what had been done, but about what had been seen coming. The defense countered. Calm, calculated. They urged jurors to focus on fact, not feeling. They dismissed the letter as an emotional relic. The voicemail as a relevant family concern. They painted Michael Jackson as a troubled artist with fantastical fears. But the words didn't land. Because even if the jury couldn't see the letter anymore, they could still feel it. Even if the video had stopped playing, they still heard his voice. And Diddy? He didn't speak again. His attorney did all the talking. But silence had begun to tell its own story. And when court was dismissed for deliberation, Paris stayed behind. Not to be seen, but to breathe. She sat alone in a quiet hallway, pulled out the letter one last time, read the final line again. If they ever try to erase your story, tell mine. It will protect you. She folded it, tucked it away. Not to hide it, but to keep it ready. Because this trial was never just about one man's actions. It was about silence. And what happens when it's broken. It was about legacy. And what happens when someone dares to carry it. And now the world had heard. Loud, clear, unforgettable. The verdict may still be waiting, but something else has already been decided. Legacy can't be silenced. Not when the truth is written in a father's hand and spoken by the daughter, strong enough to deliver it. As the city buzzed with anticipation for the verdict, something deeper began to unfold outside the courthouse, across media platforms and within the industry itself. The Jackson letter hadn't just shifted a trial, it had shattered a timeline. For decades, conversations about influence in the entertainment world came with an asterisk, rumors, innuendos, careful whispers behind closed doors. But now, those whispers had a name, a voice, and a timestamp. Inside major media outlets, editorial teams scrambled to reframe their narratives. What had once been considered tabloid drama now demanded primetime coverage. Paris Jackson's moment of reckoning headlined on networks. Talk shows opened with her quotes. Legacy publications ran full-page retrospectives on Michael Jackson's warnings, reanalyzing interviews, once dismissed as eccentric paranoia. But none of that changed the look on Paris's face as she left court. She wasn't triumphant. She wasn't defeated. She was resolved, and that more than any document or verdict became the story. Somewhere between the verdict deliberations and the press waiting outside, a generational reckoning began. Industry veterans who had stayed silent suddenly found themselves under a new kind of scrutiny. Former artists who had signed NDAs began tweeting cryptic affirmations. Journalists reopened files thought buried. And most importantly, young people fans who grew up in the post-Michael era started asking questions their parents never dared to. How had this culture survived for so long? Why had so many warnings gone unheeded? And what would have happened if Paris had chosen silence like so many before her? The answer wasn't just in the courtroom. It was in the shift. By day 20 of the trial, the courthouse became less a site of judgment and more a symbol. Protesters returned with signs that blurred the line between personal justice and systemic accountability. It's not just Diddy. Protect the next Paris. Listen when the quiet ones speak. In classrooms, professors used the trial to discuss legacy journalism and testimonial ethics. In podcasts, cultural critics revisited the rise of hip-hop empires and the unspoken lines between mentorship and control. And inside the courtroom, the judge himself made a quiet, decisive remark before closing arguments resumed. This court will rule on admissible facts, but it recognizes the impact of lived truth. That phrase, lived truth, became a new kind of standard. Not the type that replaces evidence, but the kind that contextualizes it. The kind that allows a letter, a whisper, or a voicemail to matter. For Paris, that impact wasn't theoretical, it was deeply personal. She had grown up fluent in headlines. She knew how narratives could shift, be buried, be reshaped. She also knew what it meant to carry a name so large it could eclipse your own voice. But for once, the voice the world heard wasn't just her father's. It was hers. Steady, unscripted, and undeniable. And in that courtroom, she had done what she wasn't sure she'd ever be able to protect the part of her father that no scandal or media storm could touch his intention. Not the performer, not the icon, the father, the man who saw something, feared something, and tried in his way to pass on a warning that one day might save her. And she, in turn, made sure it did more than that. She made sure it was heard. Meanwhile, the jury deliberated. 36 hours of silence followed. Speculation swirled. Online theories exploded. But inside those chambers, the jurors weren't only weighing testimonies. They were weighing truth, not just as fact, but as pattern, as legacy, as consequence. When they returned, no one knew what to expect. The judge asked for order. The room quieted. And while the final verdict would remain sealed for a few more hours, one truth had already broken free. What Michael Jackson feared wasn't just personal, it was structural. And what Paris Jackson delivered wasn't just justice, it was generational. In the days that followed, long after court ended, long after the final headlines faded, something even more powerful took hold, a cultural recalibration. Old stories were reevaluated. Power figures once thought untouchable began facing new questions. And a new phrase started to emerge among activists, journalists, and fans alike. If legacy can warn us, we better start listening. Because this wasn't just about the past, it was about making sure the future no longer repeats it. And Paris Jackson, in the quietest, most powerful way possible, had become its voice.